So we'll go ahead and get started. So as I said, I'm Tammy Kendrick, the director of the Humanities Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this latest installment of the Walter F. Edwards Brown Bag Colloquium series. And today we are hearing from two faculty members as a joint presentation by Patrick Cooper-McCann and Andrew Guinn, who are both assistant professors in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at Wayne State University. And together they have been researching the transformation of the Detroit-Windsor region since the start of the 20th century. And they're both very accomplished in many different ways that they did not put in their bio, but it is my rule, following my predecessors, different example, not to embellish people's biographies. So I'll stop there and say that today they're talking on the subject of early suburbanization in Metro Detroit. And I'll let them go ahead and take it away.
So the last time I gave a brown bag talk, it was on your predecessor, and I submitted maybe a sentence or two bio, and he managed to talk about me for about 5 minutes without having met me before. So I was pretty impressed.
Yeah. Had the same experience with him once.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
He was effusive in his praise. Okay, so thank you. She said, my name is Patrick Cooper-McCann. I'm in the Urban Studies and Planning Department along with my colleague, Andrew. And we've been working on a number of papers together over the last couple of years. And, you know, on both sides of the border, Detroit and Windsor. And I would say that, you know, if I characterize the project in general, it's trying to understand the sort of roots of urban decline in Metro Detroit. So in some ways, inspired by work by people like Thomas Crew or June Thomas. But I think that, as you'll see in today's talk, that a lot of this goes back earlier than many people realize. So, 125. So I think we all know, anyone who has lived in Metro Detroit, studied Metro Detroit at all, knows that this is a region famous for its divides. Famously, of course, it's a region divided racially. That racial division is somewhat less than it was in prior decades, but 8 Mile famously, it was like this symbolic divide in the region, and still is to some extent. You can very clearly see the divide, especially between African Americans and white residents of the region. There we go. We are a region that is extremely divided by class, with almost all middle-class neighborhoods in the suburbs and almost none in the city of Detroit, with a few notable exceptions. We are, of course, also divided in terms of growth and decline. So for basically since 1950, Detroit has been shrinking in population until maybe the last year or two. There's some signs that it might have at least stabilized and perhaps reversed. And at the same time, the metropolitan area has continued to grow and grow. And Detroit has become a smaller and smaller share of that. And these divides are really well documented. There's a lot of great books about this. Many of these books, like The Origins of the Urban Crisis, or Colored Property, or Redevelopment Race, Detroit Divided, like these are not just books that kind of tell the story of Detroit's decline, but they have shaped our kind of national understanding of the formation of the Rust Belt and of the kind of story of post-war urban decline and suburban growth. The kind of main thing we want to kind of contest today in today's talk is this idea that this is a post-war story. The story that we typically tell is one in which cities sort of reach their industrial height during World War II, and then afterwards, factories decentralize out to suburban areas. The white middle class follows, shopping centers, on and on. Robert Beauregard, he's a historian and urban planning scholar. He characterizes this as parasitic urbanization, an age in which the suburbs are growing directly at the city's expense by drawing people out. And that's roughly the framework that these other scholars use as well. George Galster calls it the housing disassembly line, that we're constantly building new at the edges in excess of our regional household growth, such that you end up seeing vacancy and abandonment at the center. And the limitation that we see with that story is that it takes the metropolitan landscape as given. It assumes that the central city is locked in place and it's surrounded by a bunch of suburbs. Well, until the 1920s, no one in Metro Detroit would have considered the region fixed in place. This map shows you, and we'll be returning to this map kind of again and again. It shows you bit by bit how different parts of what are now Detroit's boundaries were added to the city. And at the time that the auto industry first took off in the early, like around 1903, 1904, this is the city of Detroit. It's contained essentially within the Grand Boulevard. And over the next 20 years, as that industry expanded, so too did Detroit. In the same time period, almost all of the inner ring suburbs of Detroit formed as well. Before 1917, you could go back 4 decades. There are no cities forming at Detroit's periphery. There's a handful of existing communities like Wyandotte, or Pontiac. They're far away. They're separated from Detroit by farmland. There are villages, but those villages are typically a precursor to annexation. There's, kind of new suburban development. It maybe gets incorporated as a village, and then subsequently it might be annexed by Detroit. So what we want to kind of isolate in today's talk is what's up with 1917 and afterwards? Why suddenly do you have not just a few, but dozens of new municipalities forming and competing with Detroit over land to determine like how far will Detroit expand and where will this process stop and what will the consequences be? So this is basically our research question. Why did Metro Detroit splinter into separately incorporated communities after World War I? We're looking at a lot of different sources. We're right in the middle of this project, so we don't have all the answers, but we have a lot of questions, and we're going to kind of share our preliminary answers in today's talk. So we're looking at like census information. You might not know, Michigan used to conduct its own census. So not only do we have the federal census, but in the off years, like 1894, 1904, you can look at the Michigan census, and you can see the growth of these villages and cities. All kinds of planning documents, legislation, looking at reports published kind of at the time by organizations like the Detroit Bureau of Governmental Research that were kind of actively providing guidance and like thinking through these policy issues. The archives of the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, some of the suburban papers like the Royal Oak Daily Tribune, lots of maps, going to kind of local history archives in the suburbs. There's not that much written about this period. There's tons of literature about Detroit in this era. It talks about the auto industry, the UAW, and race relations, all important topics that are interrelated with this one. There's not that much attention to the formation of the suburbs. A few exceptions to this. Heather Barrow has a really interesting book about Dearborn and Henry Ford's passion for suburbia and hatred of cities. Jacob Dean Hall, who I believe, is he a PhD student here? Or no, I think he had a dissertation committee member here. But he has a really interesting dissertation about the formation of some of Detroit's industrial suburbs. Paul Sewick is the guy who writes the Detroit Urbanism blog, which is a fantastic resource on this topic. And a few other folks have written about suburbanization, at least in passing, or maybe in later decades. And then there's this really broad literature that we're starting to work our way through about, how did Boston, St. Louis, Cleveland, Chicago, et cetera, how did they all end up in the same predicament? So I don't want to give you the impression that the story we're telling today is just Detroit's story. This is a national phenomenon for sure. So I'm going to kind of start us off, and then after this kind of first point, we've got maybe 4 or 5 of them. I'm going to transition and let Andy finish up. But the first thing that you have to understand about this time period is that Detroit was literally the fastest growing city in the world during the early 1900s. Much of this driven by the auto industry. In 1900, hardly anybody was making cars. It was a passion project of a bunch of entrepreneurs. By like 1903, 1904, this was clearly going to be a big industry. And Detroit was going to be the center of it. And it led to vast investment, including the construction of a outer belt railroad to be the kind of anchoring economic development project where new factories could go. And to give you a sense of how much the region transformed, I've got a few maps to share. This is a map that a geographer produced in the 1930s, showing Detroit's development. In black, what you're seeing are manufacturing sites. So this is like the River Rouge plant, the Ford Highland Park plant. There's a bunch of different independent automakers operating over here. The Dodge Main plant there. Much of the industrial growth that occurred in this time period is anchored along these outer railroads. This red box here, this is roughly the extent of urbanization in 1900. So over this 30-year period, almost all of the additional growth, the factories, the housing, the shopping, all of that was built beyond the boundaries that the city had in 1900. It literally could not have possibly contained all of this urbanization. And to make this possible, to make all of these outlying communities livable, right, you need water and sewerage access, you need police, you need fire protection, you need lighting, you need et cetera, et cetera. So one way or another over the course of this 30 years, you either were going to see the massive expansion of the city of Detroit to encompass all of this territory that's being developed, where people are demanding services, or you're going to see the formation of a bunch of new communities, or some combination of the two. You can see that here as well. So this is another map kind of visualizing the same thing. In red here is an approximation of all of the kind of like subdivided, occupied land in this region in 1890. And in orange is how far we extended by 1920. So it caused this huge growth, especially along like Woodward, Grand River, Gratiot to some extent, downriver. And so that's sort of the question that we're raising is like, what had to happen to create a municipal infrastructure around all of that growth? And partly what occurred is that the city of Detroit expanded its boundaries to the point where much of that outer belt railroad and all of the industry that it anchored ended up being in Detroit, but not all, right? Hamtramck, Highland Park, all of the downriver suburbs. Detroit's first wave of suburbs is largely industrial. It's not the places of great wealth, it's the places of great industry that are breaking away and forming their own cities. And I'm gonna hand it over to Andy to say more about how it happened and why it happened the way that it did.
All right, thank you, Cooper.
So,
A lot to say here, complex processes, so I've got my notes to keep me on track. When Michigan became a state in 1837, the formation of cities, the definition of their boundaries was entirely up to the state legislature, not the cities themselves. So the legislature would designate large communities as cities and then create special charters for each of those cities that would determine local governing arrangements and the boundaries. And so if a city wanted to expand its boundaries, it would have to request an annexation through its representatives in the state house, and then the annexation proposal would be approved or not by the state legislature. So throughout most of the 19th century, the state controlled the size and the governing arrangements of cities. But this all started to change at the end of the 1800s. There's a pair of laws in 1895 that allow smaller communities to incorporate without special permission from the legislature using standard general law frameworks that are kind of like standardized across these smaller communities. A major change comes in 1908 with the passage of the new state constitution, and then the following year in 1909 with the Home Rule Cities Act. So under the Home Rule Act, the incorporation of a new city or the annexation of territory to an existing city comes about through a new process. So voters in the affected territory would circulate a petition, which must receive signatures from like 1% of the eligible voters or meet a threshold of property owners within that territory. And if the petition receives enough signatures, it would go to a vote. And for the vote to be successful, the annexing territory, so like the voters of the city of Detroit would need to be majority in favor of the annexation. the people in the territory to be annexed would also need a majority in support of the vote, and then majority in the township from which that territory would be annexed would also need to support the annexation. So these rules not only nullified the power of the state legislature, but they also undermine the power of existing governments because it's all up to just like voters circulating petitions. There's no role for city councils or mayors. And so it puts voters in charge of organizing this process, including real estate speculators and developers, industrial tycoons, and ambitious politicians who want to create their own communities. So that's kind of like the key turning point, but on its own, it doesn't induce a rash of new incorporations. There are a few additional amendments that come through subsequent years. In 1917, Public Act 225 allowed villages to incorporate as cities on their own without permission from the township, provided that there's no change in boundaries. And this was passed in order to allow Highland Park to form as a city. It was previously a village. And then a 1923 act, which granted additional powers to townships and villages to issue bonds, to finance their own improvements. So there's less reason to annex to a large city. And then in 1929, the Metropolitan District Act allows cities to join together in order to jointly finance and to provide services, water, sewer, and other key services. So that also kind of like decreases the inducement to join with Detroit, because suburbs can join together and do this on their own. So against this backdrop, there are these legislative changes that happen. And meanwhile, Detroit's growth is exploding, as Cooper was saying, through the formation growth of the auto industry and related industries. So by 1930 or so, we've inherited this legal framework that was based in the early 1900s, but the urban context of the region had completely changed, much bigger, much more complex, and approaching 2 million people by the mid-century. So that's kind of like the legal demographic context of this story. Initially, through this period of growth, outlying residents were very eager to join the city of Detroit in order to gain access to the infrastructure and services that Detroit could uniquely provide. But over time, this calculus changes. In the 1890s, the territory of Detroit within the city limits, let's see if I can, as Cooper was saying, we're looking inside the boulevard. And then Detroit is surrounded by a series of townships: Grosse Pointe Township, Hamtramck Township, Greenfield Township, Springwells Township. And villages are nested within these townships. Villages are basically creatures of the township, and they rely on the township to provide services. They pay their taxes to the township. In this map, Highland Park was actually the only village in the 1890s that was on Detroit's borders. Everything else was just unincorporated township territory. But over the next decade, additional villages would form on Detroit's border. We have Delray and Woodmere in Springwells Township, Grosse Pointe Park forms out here. We've got the village of Hamtramck forming within Hamtramck Township. All these are brought into existence by about 1906. And Detroit is going to annex Delray, Woodmere, but not Highland Park. It's going to annex some of this territory out into Grosse Pointe Township in order to control the base of Connor Creek, which is important, to ensure the supply of clean drinking water to the city. But following the passage of the Home Rule Act in 1909, as I mentioned, the process of annexing territory changes. It's now up to voters in the annexing territory to decide how borders are going to be redrawn. So joining or becoming a city would usually entail higher tax rates compared to being part of a township or a village. But it was attractive because cities had greater capacity to issue bonds and greater capacity to install and maintain public infrastructure. Also, by charter, cities were required to supply urban services across their territory, water and sewage infrastructure being the most important for health and living standards, but access to police, fire protection is also meaningful. So so that's an inducement to join a city. Furthermore, if an annexed village or township had issued bonds as a village to improve local infrastructure, the remaining debt obligations when they join the city are assumed by the city. And so if you start to improve your territory, build roads, pave roads, build out pipage, those debt obligations would then fall to the city of Detroit overall. So that's an additional reason to join the city. However, for land-intensive agricultural uses, lumber, coal yards, farms, annexation would mean a steeper property bill. So owners of those kinds of businesses and farmers might resist annexation. But for residential communities that were forming on Detroit's borders, annexation made sense. Detroit's first annexation under the home rule system came in 1912. Roughly 1 square mile portion of Greenfield Township. In this case, the petition for this annexation was led by County Road Commissioner Edward Hines in order to facilitate the paving of Grand River Avenue. Detroit didn't annex any more territory after 1912 until 1915. In this area here, there are 6 proposals. Landowners and real estate firms had begun subdividing and developing land. And since access to city services, especially water and sewer, conveyed great value to the potential home buyers, the prospect of annexation could elevate demand for land near Detroit's borders. So the owners of that land could command a higher price when selling it. So real estate developers, landowners want annexation. So in this case, developers circulated petitions, 6 petitions in early 1915, and they received enough signatures to advance to the ballot. As you can see in this real estate advertisement on the right, which was published during the summer of 1915, they draw attention to the probability of annexation in the coming vote, which would take place in the following November. And as more people with an interest in, so this is encouraging people to buy these lots, they'll become annexed. As more people buy those lots, then they are able to participate in the vote. And so there's greater interest backing the annexation of that territory into Detroit. They add to the eligible voter base in the township that would vote in favor of annexation and dilute the votes of township residents further out that might object to losing that tax base to the city. And so this, the area that this real estate advertisement indicates is today, kind of like this area here between Van Dyke and the airport north of I-94, kind of like a weird subdivision in terms of like how the streets got laid out. But just to kind of like situate where we're at. So the next big annexation comes in 1916, real estate developers are very quickly learning that they can take charge not only of subdividing land, but also orchestrating the petition process. And so now increasingly developers are becoming the main forces behind the selection of boundaries for annexation, the circulation of petitions to get votes on these boundaries, the formation of pro-annexation parties within the unincorporated territory, and the circulation of political messaging in favor of annexation through the Free Press, Detroit News, the media organs. So by 1915, 1916, real estate firms have really become the main drivers of the annexation process, pushing voters to annex lands that the developers owned in order to inflate the prices of those lands so that they could increase their profits. So on the eve of the 1916 vote, Robert Oakman, kind of like friend of Henry Ford, argued in the Detroit Free Press that Detroit voters should favor annexation now rather than after the area is further built up. Because with all these services given by Detroit, better houses and business blocks will be assured, as well as improved school and church accommodations, all of which will benefit the territory as well as Detroit at large. That section will be built up twice as rapidly as annexed to the city, helping a great measure to solve the present housing problem. And he also argued that the organization of annexed territory by real estate developers would be beneficial because he claimed that in unrestricted territory without sewer and water service, there is a tendency to build undesirable shacks, which it takes a long time to eradicate and which are liable to be detrimental to surrounding property. So the kinds of restrictions that he was talking about would have prohibited the changing the characteristics of a lot, such as tearing down a one-family home to build a duplex, building a neighborhood corner store, or crucially permitting racial minorities to occupy that lot, racially restrictive covenants. And so all these were things that, were held up to positively impact the market value of the surrounding property. That said, some of the area that was annexed in 1916 was not controlled by developers, such as the Conant Park area, and so it didn't come with like these restrictive covenants. So consequently, Conant Park in the late 1920s is becoming a middle-class African-American community. I'm sorry, Conant Gardens. Here's a map of the boundaries of Detroit in 1920, along with the holdings of the B.E. Taylor real estate firm. They have a lot of, subdivided land on the west side and unincorporated Greenfield and Redford townships. B.E. Taylor organized petition drive and got these lands annexed to Detroit in 1924 and 1925. Now, up to the 1920s, Detroit civic leaders and elected officials had a pretty liberal attitude towards annexation. They adding more territory to the city. Why? Because they welcomed the prospect of adding taxable property to the city's tax base, both immediately bringing in built-up areas and also as annexed areas got built up over time, this would enhance the city's tax base. As the city brought in more taxable property within its borders, its bond limit was also increased on public bond markets, so it could borrow more money in order to finance improvements to citywide services. On the flip side, though, if a large taxpayer, such as a factory, joined a township or village, residents of that community had less reason to join Detroit. Their tax base could already, with the factory, their tax base could already support infrastructure improvements, possibly at a lower millage rate than if they joined the city of Detroit. So voters in industrial villages like Highland Park and Hamtramck resisted annexation to Detroit and instead incorporated as their own cities in order to improve their urban infrastructure. These communities, Highland Park and Hamtramck, had the two largest factory complexes in the world at that time, the Fort Highland Park plant and then Dodge, Maine, and Hamtramck. Highland Park incorporates its own city in 1917, facilitated by that law, that legal change that I had discussed, and then Hamtramck in 1922. And then other industrial suburbs like Dearborn, River Rouge, following that process. So these incorporations, just kind of like take the village boundaries and then turn it into a city. So even through the 1920s, this separation of Detroit from its smaller suburbs, especially Hamtramck and Highland Park, which were like nestled within the city's boundaries, this was assumed to be a temporary arrangement. The common understanding among everybody, both the residents of Highland Park, Hamtramck, and those of Detroit, was that these industrial suburbs would, initially finance high quality improvements to their built environment, but eventually everybody assumed these places, of course, are going to become part of the city of Detroit at some point. Never happened, as we all know. So there's kind of like these institutional changes. I also want to talk about public services and infrastructure, the most important for urban development being water supply. It kind of illustrates some of the shifting dynamics of urbanization and annexation during these years of incredible industrialization and population growth. So we've got the Detroit Board of Water. They're relatively weak and politically independent. The city council only has the power to remove members for very serious reasons, such as fraud. Otherwise, the board members are politically insulated, and had close ties with real estate developers. And the board was allowed to provide and sell water to whomever they wanted. So it was in the economic interest of the board to sell water to as many communities as it could, including villages outside of Detroit, townships outside of Detroit, cities outside of Detroit. Because as new customers were added to the system, the water board could issue more bonds and support continued investments to keep growing the system. Furthermore, wholesaling water to non-Detroit areas was good business. The Board of Water was allowed to charge them twice the rate, and communities were obligated to construct their own pipage. So while outlying areas had an incentive to join Detroit in order to receive water at a lower price, the Board of Water did not use its monopoly of the water supply to compel annexation. So this map is from 1921, and maybe those of you further back can't see all the lines, but this shows the extent of the Detroit Water Board's infrastructure as of 1921. Detroit was supplying water through its own territory as well as outlying villages such as Grosse Pointe Park, Ferndale, Springwells, River Rouge, Ecorse, the village of Oakwood. And that same year, it also built the water filtration system, kind of making its water even more valuable. The water board anticipated further annexation in all directions, and it developed plans to supply water to areas north up to 12 Mile Road and west out past Inkster Road. However, Detroit, and the water board kind of lacked the capacity to actually build all this infrastructure to service it. In 1927, Royal Oak, which is, at this point is a city, starts to build the North Woodward Avenue water system. And by 1929, it's supplying water to Royal Oak, Pleasant Ridge, and Huntington Woods. This is an image of the water tower in Royal Oak that was built to support the project and improve groundwater. So under the North Woodward Avenue arrangement, Royal Oak would get water from two sources. One, it would purchase it from Detroit and then distribute that water, or it would pump its own groundwater and distribute that supply as well. And then Royal Oak entered into intermunicipal contracts with surrounding communities in order to supply that water. So Royal Oak is now in charge of northern distribution to Pleasant Ridge, Huntington Woods, later to Clawson. Some communities incorporate just to be able to negotiate better terms with Royal Oak to receive water, for example, Berkeley. And all of these effects from the creation of the North Woodward Avenue system start to prompt suburban growth and independence from Detroit in southern Oakland County. Meanwhile, by the 1920s, Detroit's elected officials are just begging voters to stop approving more annexations. Cities' boundaries are extending too fast in a very low density way, and providing the infrastructure for all these new single family homes is incredibly expensive. The last annexations were approved in 1926. Now, Detroit generally wanted to capture industry, but by the mid-1920s, the city's leadership and ultimately its voters were increasingly opposed to additional annexation, even when outlying communities clamored for it. Already in 22, good government advocates in the Detroit Bureau of Government Research and Public Research Office within Detroit's bureaucracy began to sound the alarm about the pace of Detroit's expansion, as you can see from this excerpt here. While they acknowledged the benefits of annexing close inland that already had installed decent roads and water infrastructure, and they supported bringing in villages with a taxable industrial base like Highland Park or Hamtramck, the Bureau is warning that continued annexations of large swaths of land, such as that which occurred in 1916, would impose more costs than benefits on the city. Indeed, Detroit struggled to service all the new land that it was annexing in a timely way. Residents of North Detroit Village, which was included in the 1916 annexation, were slow to receive water and sewer service up until 1922 in some places. This was due to multiple factors, including the scale of improvements that were required on so much land, along with shortages of labor and material during World War I. Also, Detroit had assumed many new responsibilities around 1920. So, for example, Detroit bought the streetcar service, which was a private organization up until that point. And when it municipalized the streetcar and transit services, adds a major expense to Detroit's books. In 1922, Oakwood Village, which is that little strip of land on Detroit's west side where the Marathon plant is today, kind of nestled between Melvindale, Dearborn, River Rouge, etc., was added to the city. This was in 1922, but it faced pretty long delays in receiving local streetcar service under the city's Department of Street Railways. And so these experience of newly brought in communities start to create distrust about annexation in outlying areas, and it starts to form the formation of anti-annexation parties to oppose the pro-annexation parties that real estate developers are starting to orchestrate. Anti-annexationists in Redford and Greenfield townships observed the delay with which downriver communities had been receiving services in the lead up to their annexation vote in 1923. This was ultimately approved, bringing in what today is the Grandmont Rosedale area. Leaders in these communities are starting to publish anti-annexation stuff in newspapers. For example, it is our best judgment that annexation under limits prescribed by B.E. Taylor, Clemens Knight, and other real estate interests is not to your advantage, and that the limits of the next annexation should be made by the people who are to be benefited rather than by parties who have no interest at stake other than the exploitation of lands beyond the annexed limit. If these men believed that annexation were a good thing for the residents of the annexed territory, they would not have stopped the limit of annexation at the boundaries of the land which they own. So in short, opposition to continuing annexations is growing both in government and in society. By 1926, Detroit is facing a fiscal crisis. It's running up against its bond limit, so it cannot issue additional bonds without raising taxes or downgrading its bond rating, and facing higher borrowing costs. In 1926, City Controller Percy Monteith warned that City Council would need to increase the millage rates in order to finance further major public works. At the same time, the Detroit School Board warned that it faced a fiscal crisis as well as a result of taking on too much debt from newly built schools in annexed territory, especially the portion of Redford School District that had just come into the city a couple years prior. That same year, Council President John Lodge said the city was incurring too many capital costs through the purchase of new equipment for the Detroit Department of Street Railways for the transit service in order to provide services to outlying areas, again, especially Redford, which was way out from the center of Detroit. So thus the city council and the government bureaucracy had publicly come out against further annexations in the downriver villages of Melvindale and the newly incorporated city of Lincoln Park, both of which asked for a petition to join the city of Detroit. And so both of these votes failed in 1926. Melvindale ended up incorporating as a city in 1933. Both it and Lincoln Park, of course, remain independent to this day. And Detroit never grew again after 1926. In 1930, Detroit's fiscal pressures were compounded by the onset of the Great Depression, but nevertheless, proposed annexations came up in Hazel Park, Warren Township, and East Detroit, which is now known as East Point. This time, voters in each of these three territories overwhelmingly approved annexation to the city of Detroit, but for the first time, Detroit voters themselves turned down the annexation of these new communities. And so Detroit's border now is really cemented at 8 Mile Road. So, rapid population growth, industrialization, development is continuing on Detroit's outskirts, and the inability of the city to keep up with this growth ultimately proved ruinous. Already in the 1920s, as the population of the region as a whole is growing like crazy, factories are getting built all over the place along that Terminal Beltline railroad that Cooper was talking about. And in the industrial suburbs, the oldest innermost areas of the city, the gray areas on this map, are starting to actually lose population and they're deindustrializing. Area inside the Grand Boulevard is losing residents that are relocating to newer subdivisions further out from City Hall, and factories along the riverfront were relocating to more modern facilities further out, leaving behind warehouses and parking lots. So, cities, which are the blue line here, by 1940, 1950 are starting to dominate the landscape. Villages are becoming less relevant as they're either annexed to Detroit or incorporated as their own cities. And Detroit, which is the kind of light blue section here, is becoming a less important, it's capturing a lower and lower share of the region's overall population. So we've got really dramatic growth through the 1910s and 20s. But most of the growth after 1930 is happening in other cities and in unincorporated townships. Detroit's share of the total regional population peaks around 1910 or 1920. And meanwhile, outlying cities and outlying townships are a greater share of the overall regional population. So that's the story. To sum up, the decentralization of industry and wealth, decline of older neighborhoods is really an interwar story, not a post-World War II story. And so we need to kind of like turn back the clock when we're talking about what quote unquote went wrong in Detroit. Related to this, the political fragmentation of the region originated in this interwar period. And it's very much closely linked with the home rule framework that we adopted earlier in the century, as well as political choices made by cities, suburbs, and the state through the 1920s. So this is where we're at in our research. Thank you for paying attention, listening. I hope this mostly made sense, and we really welcome any questions that you all have. Also, we want to thank Mila Puccini, who's actually here. She is our research assistant for a lot of this. She led the research on like water infrastructure, did a lot of really great work. And we want to thank the Humanities Center again for hosting this talk. So thank you.
Okay, and now we open it up for questions.
Yes.
Oh, there's the question in is there a question in the Zoom?
Somebody that raised their
Brian
hand.
Moore raised his hand?
Jeff.
Yeah, I actually had a clarification and I guess I had two questions. The first one is a short one. Well, first, thanks for doing this talk. I've actually been researching this, similar topic for a story, and it's kind of very timely that this came up. I've found a lot of resources that say the amendment to the Home Rule Act was in 1926. So was there a separate amendment in 1926, or was it in just 1917, and other contemporary sources might just be mixing that up with the year that annexation stopped?
The Home Rule Act was amended repeatedly.
Oh, got it. Okay, so there was maybe multiple over the years.
Yeah, like if you Google the legislation and you look at it, you'll see like a dozen different changes. Depends, you can look up the Michigan compiled law and like see in an individual year like where's the statute at currently, but it did change.
Okay.
Yeah. And we've been trying to figure out which amendments matter, which ones are important. So like this 1917 one is important, we conclude, but I'll look into this 1926 one that you're mentioning also.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I know Paul Sewick's urbanism blog. I think that's one of the resources where he mentions the amendment from 26 too. I know you guys had that as a source. My larger question was, why did Detroit never annex across 8 Mile Road? I mean, I recognize that it was a county line and, a perceived boundary, but even when you look at other cities like Atlanta that fall on a county line, like they've still annexed land off into DeKalb County, in spite of that reinforced border. And so when you look at like the edge of the city at 1915, the edge along 8 Mile isn't very significant. It's not really establishing it as a firm datum. And it's not until the annexations of 1925 and 1926 where that like crisp, solid line really appears. But when that happened, like Southfield and Warren weren't incorporated in cities and wouldn't incorporate until the 50s. So like, why was that boundary respected and reinforced so strongly? Do you guys have any theories?
A couple. Yeah, you're right. Like those are communities that incorporated in the 1950s. And basically at that point, you start to have this movement where like townships are incorporating as fully blown cities. Warren, Southfield, Livonia. And that, yes, that's a post-war thing. Why didn't Detroit annex into into Oakland County or Macomb County prior to that. So as we talked about, there were proposals to do so. And it was, by the point that that had become a prospect for the city of Detroit, it was already entering a fiscal crisis. So that's one, aspect of what's going on. So joining Detroit is maybe less attractive for some of those outlying communities because they're like, well, we're going to get brought into Detroit, but it'll take even longer for us to receive services. Meanwhile, the city's leadership is imploring voters to not annex more land. So there's kind of like anti-annexation sentiment going on in the voter base. There were legal questions about whether or not the city of Detroit could annex additional land outside of Wayne County because its city charter had written into the language that like the city of Detroit, which covers land, within Wayne County, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's debate, does that mean that Detroit would need to either change its charter or like request for special permission from the state in order to annex land outside of Wayne County? The legal opinion was somewhat mixed on that question, but it seemed like the consensus would be that the language of the Home Rule Act would supersede those concerns. Basically, if somebody put that onto a proposal, the votes in favor carried, then that land, there would be lawsuits to be sure, but probably the courts would decide in favor of the annexation. That was never actually tested, so we don't know.
Is there any aspect that like for the land speculators that were trying to get like, the land that they were developing annexed, that it was like simplified for them to just be in one county instead of multiple as well?
Exactly. Yeah, that was kind of like the other point that I was starting to forget. Like they didn't want to risk a drawn out legal battle in order to sell their land and get it annexed to Detroit. That would, for them, it's easier and more profitable to just keep going west within Wayne County. And since they're, according to our research, the key actors in pushing and shaping the process of annexation, if they saw risk to their profitability, to their business model in kind of like waiting for possibly uncertain legal outcome about annexation across county borders, that was a reason to not push for those annexations and instead to push for annexations that would be more certain. That's my sense. Cooper.
The only thing I'd add, we did do a little bit of research about kind of like, okay, so like we see how this process grinds to the halt in the late 20s. Like Detroit's broke, voters are fed up with the services they, aren't receiving. They don't want to add any more land. What about later on? Coming out of World War II, there's a proposal pushed by the UAW to expand Detroit's boundaries. To say like, we need to extend beyond our current capacity. And there's like some appetite for it politically in Detroit. But one of the things that changes is that in 1947, Michigan creates a new kind of city that doesn't exist in any other state, charter townships. They say, we'll allow communities that aren't ready to become cities to be this interim thing. It doesn't like exactly line up with Detroit sort of being like, not pursuing this any further. But I think coming out of World War II, there basically was zero appetite in any suburb to join Detroit. Like it had ceased to become something desirable. Like there were no more Hazel Parks clamoring to try to join Detroit still. And instead, the state of Michigan made it even easier for communities to go their own way if they so chose.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think you had a hand, Jeffrey, earlier.
Yeah. It looks to me like 1915 is a very important moment. And in particular, that between about 1915 and 1919, when the city redoes its charter, and what you don't speak about, but I think is interesting, and it may or may not be germane, is that right around 1915, if I'm remembering correctly, there's a commission to do some city planning for the first time.
Yeah.
It's the first stirrings of the City Beautiful movement in Detroit. And then also, we're beginning to see a kind of hunger for progressive era reforms as well. And I'm wondering about how these if at all they play any role in that drive towards annexation, because I noticed in that map that you have of that burst of annexation, it really starts in 1915 and then peters out in the early 1920s, which of course also corresponds with this enormous growth in the city's wealth, which then immediately starts tapering off after about the mid-20s, if I remember correctly. So I'm curious about whether these other factors are playing a role here as well. And I'm interested if you come across anything or if this is shaping your thinking.
I'd say we have similar questions, but not answers.
Hmm.
One thing I want to look at is that Detroit adopts its home rule charter in 1918. It rejected the first attempt, which was in 1914. But I have no idea why. I don't know the politics around it or what was bad about the earlier charter that voters preferred about the later one. And then with respect to planning, I've read a lot of those early planning documents. And part of the mystery is sort of like, why didn't planning take hold? They did try. So like I just pulled up, like I have notes on my computer, like 1915, the city hired Arthur Comey to write a plan that's called the Detroit Suburban Planning Report, report to the City Plan and Improvement Commission. And if you look at that document, it's all about like, here's how we wish land was being subdivided. And it also, and there's reports from that time period about like, here's where the good like bits of forest land in the region are. Like these would be great places as parks. And I did my own dissertation about the expansion of parks and recreational services, like over the Detroit's history. And this is a period where really like most of Detroit's larger parks were all purchased in the 1920s. They took out a big bond in 1919 to do it. At the time when they're scoping out, like where are we gonna, like Rouge Park, Eliza Howell Park, Chandler Park, like those are all outside of city boundaries at the time that they're like negotiating to purchase. And so that's an intriguing question. Like we kind of started with water and sewerage as a like beginning point to examine service provision, because without it, you don't have a community. That's like fundamental to this process. And some communities successfully used water and sewerage as leverage, like some other cities, to force their outlying territory to become part of the city. Detroit didn't. And we kind of think we see why that is. But kind of next up on our mind is like we want to look at like streetcar service, which there I think the story is largely one of obsolescence, where it just so happens that right in the same moment, of course, the Detroit's growth industry is cars, and increasingly the communities aren't that bent out of shape if they don't get good streetcar service. We want to look at parks and to understand like what's the legal authority to be buying this land outside of city boundaries. I know like one of the acts that was passed that probably should be part of this story is that in 1893, that's when Senator Palmer donated Palmer Park to this city of Detroit. It was well outside of Detroit boundaries. The state legislature passed a bill before he did so that said that Detroit was allowed to extend city services to any outlying park. So that, like there's a lot of kind of interesting little things to try to understand. But with respect to the main question about planning, it's like Detroit had these efforts toward it, but it really didn't adopt any official plan. And partly it just seems like it was overwhelmed.
There was one, and it was the plan to create the cultural center.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's
yeah, there was that. I mean, there's I mentioned the City Beautiful movement. I mean, I think there was a push-pull thing going on in terms of thinking about civic amenities, not
Right.
parks exactly, but certainly libraries and museums. Is the waterfront seemed to be no longer the place to do it.
Yeah.
And so there was a drive to look up in different directions, and it ended up being Woodward Avenue, right out here, of
Right.
course.
There's
Yeah,
also like
I'm gonna labor the point, but yeah.
you could differentiate too between like who's calling the shots. Like in the same period, the City Beautiful type folks had more sway, say in Chicago, than here. Partly that's about like where did like industry locate? Like in Chicago, industry sprawled toward the south, toward the Calumet region. And it's some somewhat similar story, but like industrialists held a lot of sway in Detroit. And they weren't interested and didn't care much about planning. So I may be part of it. I don't know.
The World's Fair made a big difference.
Yeah.
I would add as well, like the way that things ended up seemed like inevitable in retrospect, but there were all these other proposals and ideas. Like everybody assumed Highland Park Hamtramck would of course be a part of the city of Detroit. And then kind of one of the major kind of progressive era organizations that sprung up during this period of time is also the Board of Governmental Research. And they're expecting that there's going to be a city-county consolidation. They're proposing different, stronger forms of a metropolitan district. And so there are other proposals out there that would kind of rationalize this process more than what actually happened, but they didn't come to fruition. That's another thing that we're trying to look for. What are these other ways that things might have turned out?
I think let's take all the questions maybe, since we don't have that much time and we got 2 people up there and 2 people here. So let's just go through and do the questions and then we'll try to figure out which order to answer. So you start.
My question was, you ended, you were talking, you got to World War II, and I was thinking, wasn't that around the period where the Great Migration started to
Yes.
occur, and then you had that kind of, then where does race enter the picture? And I'm thinking, you had African American veterans trying to get housing, all sorts of complicated issues there. So that was in the back of my mind.
Good question.
Yeah, I'm thinking, and I live in Pleasant Ridge, and I help with our historical records, so.
Oh, okay.
The conversation is very interesting to me. I recall some conversations around the creation of superhighways leading from Livernois and Main Street going all the way to Port Huron that didn't happen. And people just generally choosing that the minute that Woodward became paved, they didn't have to live in Detroit.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to see, what impacts the creation of roads because of the sales of cars to people that worked at car companies had on that in the 20s and in the early 30s. And if you're ever needing information from Pleasant Ridge, feel free. I'd be happy to provide it and get our historical commission together for you.
It's a good question. That's definitely part of the story, is like this huge expansion of highways in the 20s.
Well, that might partly answer my question. I'm coming to this from the background in London's rise, which was also exploding at this time period. And there, the cultural representation of suburbs was all about being a kind of remove from the city, a kind of bucolic life that was available there. So I was wondering if that was the same in the Detroit case, and if it made a difference that in the case of London, the suburbs were accessed by public transit. And it was the spread of trams and the subway that made possible the rise of the suburbs. But is it the case that the car was the mode that would allow for movement to the suburbs, and or you mentioned that some of these suburbs had manufacturing centers? Was it the case that they were just as people would be assumed to stay to work where they lived? In other words,
Streetcars and streetcar suburbs are a big part of the story, and so kind of like moving from that to automotive is happening. We had like bucolic middle class suburbs like the Grosse Pointes that are forming, had streetcar terminals in those areas, and then up to like Berkeley, the Woodward corridor as well.
One quick difference on that point is that the bourgeois utopias, like the Grosse Pointes, they largely are choosing to form as villages, and they stay in that status for a really long time. The communities that choose to become full-fledged cities with a higher rate of taxation and more services are all of these industrial enclaves. And so many of the early suburbs to Detroit, like Highland Park, Hamtramck, River Rouge, Ecorse, these places, number one, in terms of their built environment, are indistinguishable from Detroit. They're not enclaves of the wealthy. They're industrial, they're working class. They're rated in yellow and red on the redlining map from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but they have a big tax base, and that enables them to be their own community if they so choose.
We've got 2 online, Cami and then Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks. So I have 2 questions. This is an interesting presentation. I was wondering, where is the federal government in your analysis? Because at this time, there's a federal grant economy for infrastructure, water especially. And so I'm, and also you said that this is not happening just in Detroit, it's happening, in other nationwide. So there's a broader impetus to even state action. So I was wondering what the incentive structure or even guidance in terms of the model legislation and so on was coming from the federal government. So that's one question. The other is the link to planning, but in a slightly different tangent to the previous question about planning. And that is, I was struck by this very wise sort of smart growth quote in your newspaper article about we shouldn't annex more land because it's then we have need for, or then actually warrants it warrants the annexation. And it's really a smart growth argument. It's wasteful for current residents in terms of the taxes that they have to pay, and really it's not needed, just as a speculative future measure. So I'm wondering what the lessons for planning are, just in terms of your reflection of this history. I understand your question, and I looked at your bottom line sort of tentative conclusions, but more broadly, both for the region as well as from the perspective of the state and the possible leadership that the state might exert on, in terms of efficient use of resources and more sustainable outcomes and so on. What are some lessons for planning?
Carolyn? You're muted.
Oops, sorry, I unmuted and then remuted, sorry. This is really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing research. I was thinking about Jacksonville when you were talking, and that's, a favorite example of a non-boundary constrained city that every time there's new development, new tax base at the edge, it just gets incorporated into the city. And that's sort of always been a story I tell as a counterexample of Detroit. I think there's a lot I didn't know about how Detroit grew and how those annexation decisions got made. My question is a lot like Kami's, which is, if you had been there and you could have directed this process to go any way you wanted, to the benefit of the city, to the benefit of the region, what would you have done differently? How would you have wanted this to go?
I think that, so in that Bureau of Governmental Research report that we cited, that kind of had these like what we'd call smart growth sentiments today, like annex, territory that's close in, but now more than you need. One of the things that they proposed was an amendment to the Home Rule Act, which would allow city councils to veto annexation proposals. And so to kind of, basically there's no state role or government role in this entire process. Under the Home Rule Act, as well as most of the amendments, everything was just turned over to society, which meant that it was orchestrated by the real estate industry, who had the greatest interest in shaping how these things turned out. So tools such as like a veto point that would fall to the local government would be one way of amending this process that I think makes sense. I need to think about it some more, but that would be one proposal. And that, the way that things have played out since then, Cooper talked about the Charter Township Act. By the 1980s, the way that, there's no annexations really that are happening. Everything that happens now is through 425 arrangements or 425 agreements, which are contracts to share tax base between different territories. So Lansing has a bunch of these, different townships are introducing them. Land that's covered by a 425 agreement also cannot be annexed by a city. So there are ways that townships kind of set aside land through a 425 arrangement that can never be annexed by a city for 50 or 100 years. And so I think the way that legislation and the system has evolved has really kept pushing decisions down at a lower and lower level, taking away the authority of cities or local governments in general in order to have any say in this matter. And I think like a veto or just a stronger governmental role would be helpful.
Another point of comparison. So in our prior work, we compared the history of industrialization in Detroit and Windsor. Windsor basically went through this exact same process. When we talk about Windsor today, you know, it is a single large amalgamated city that covers not just most of the urban area, but also the near countryside. You know, like the outer parts of Windsor are farmland. There are other communities adjacent to it. It's not one city across the entire urban area, but it's most of the urban area. That didn't just happen magically. When Detroit was expanding in the same time period, Windsor wasn't Windsor, it was the border cities. It was separately incorporated communities. You had Windsor itself, Sandwich, Ojibwe, and on the other side, Ford City. Ford City is very much like Highland Park, Hamtramck. It's this little 2 square mile enclave, heavily industrialized, grew up around the Ford factory and other auto companies. And in the late 1920s, both Detroit and Windsor, like the border cities, experienced a crisis as the economy slowed down. Then you had the crash in 1929. Huge amount of territory had been subdivided on both sides, like platted, ready for development, and then all of that development just stopped. Detroit nearly went bankrupt in the Great Depression. The border cities also were on the verge of bankruptcy. And the thing that's different is that in Ontario, the provincial government, which is much stronger than our state government, because in a provincial system, a single party controls the whole government. You know, like whoever's in power controls all the power. It's not a divided government. So in the 30s, the provincial government of Ontario created an oversight board that could, if it so chose, it could force governments to merge together. It could, you know, it could adjudicate like boundary disputes. It could decide which communities were expanding or not. And that's the system that Ontario has used ever since. So it started as a response to the border cities in particular, because Ford City was going to go bankrupt. Next door to Ford City, I forgot, the fifth border city is Walkerville. Walkerville is the most prosperous. It's sort of like the Grosse Pointe of Windsor. And they said, well, you know, you're going to hate it, but Walkerville, you are going to help pay off Ford City's debts. You're right next to each other. You're all going to be one community from now on. And then in the 1960s, Windsor got amalgamated again. A lot of the new industrial investments that took place in the 60s under the Auto Pact, that was like a big boon to industry in Canada in that time period. They were happening outside of Windsor's municipal boundaries. And the province stepped in and said, okay, we're merging Windsor with its nearby suburbs, its former township areas, so that all of this taxable land is going to be within city boundaries. And then it happened again in 2003. So that's a different system. I don't think necessarily we need a world in which Detroit ended up being hundreds of square miles in size. But what we did need to avoid were tiny cities whose tax base was insufficient to support them fiscally going forward. And if we went back to the slide where we say, well, which communities formed first? Think about the list of communities in Michigan that are perennially on the verge of bankruptcy. On that list are Detroit, of course, but also Highland Park, Hamtramck, River Rouge, Ecorse. It's partially not just about this story, because it's very much a story about race and racism, but it is also a story about the fact that these are tiny communities that once briefly had, you know, the biggest, most productive factories in the world that shut down and left and could never recuperate their tax base. And in some cases, like Highland Park, they took on insane liabilities. Like Highland Park built its own water system and ran a pipe all the way to Lake St. Clair. And then Ford left like 10 years later. And they're like, oh my gosh, you know, what do we do? So yeah, we need fewer local governments, not necessarily one. But we never have had the kind of like state level intervention to bring any kind of rationality to our metropolitan area.
All right. Oh, sorry, we're now about 10 minutes past. And I've been told not to let Humanities Center events go on too long. So I'm going to close down the open conversation and invite people to come up and chat with our speakers afterward and thank them once again. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.